Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Lawton. I'm the Special Projects Editorial Director for SC Media. Welcome to today's 2020 webcast, Tomorrow's Attacks Today. Today's webcast is brought to you by Juniper. 2020 webcasts are a production of the SC Media Editorial Department. You can think of this as a casual discussion with a subject matter expert. This is not a product pitch. With that said, let's move on. Please welcome to our studios today Mounir Hahad, the head of threat research at Juniper Networks. He's a seasoned cybersecurity expert who focuses on malware research, detection techniques, and threat intelligence. He leads the Juniper Threat Labs, the organization at Juniper that identifies and tracks malicious threats in the wild and ensures that the company's products can block these malicious attacks. Prior to joining the company, he was the head of Cyphert Labs and has held various leadership positions at Cisco and Ironport. There will be a Q&A following the presentation, so we do encourage you to type any questions you have for Mounir via the interface. Welcome, Mounir. Let's get started here. You know, it's 2 a.m. Do you know where that threat to your network is coming from at this hour? If not, perhaps you need to beef up your threat intelligence and identification. Today, not only are threats constant, they're often masked as either valid data transmissions or nothing more than a simple communications via email or a messaging app. It also might be a fileless attack in the form of a query that asks the user to take some kind of action that might seem rather benign. Today's webcast looks at the current threat prevention landscape, as well as looking ahead to what we might see in the months and years to come. You know, to open things up, Mounir, let's talk a little bit about priorities. The priorities of a multinational are certainly going to be different from those of an SMB or a midsize or even a regional company that might have different capabilities than its larger brethren. Let's say you're a new CSO or a CSO at a mid-sized company. You don't have necessarily all of the assets that a multinational would have. Where would you even start when it comes to setting security priorities?
Good morning, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me today. Good morning to all our audience, and good afternoon to the people who are on the East Coast. That's a very good question. Let's just look at what happened just in this past week. Isn't it interesting? I'm just, putting up a slide here. I really like this tweet that I saw from somebody online. Man, so many issues a CISO would have had to deal with this week that it's not even funny. So, to answer your question, hopefully, right, as a new CISO, you're not starting from scratch. There's already an established security practice that you may have inherited from your predecessor, and obviously it will take you time to absorb your new realm with its strengths and weaknesses. And I don't mean by that just the tools and processes you have in place, but also the company culture around security, what the budgets are, what policies play into funding new projects, etc. That usually takes time. But let's say you've gone around a couple of months and you didn't have to fight too many fires. Now it's time to look forward, like you said, Stephen, depending on the company size or even the vertical you're in, or just how popular your brand is, you will be facing a different kind of threats, and that will dictate your priorities. So let's say you're a small or medium-sized business, for example, with no frills, you're probably fighting a mundane blind attacks every day. You got intrusion attempts, using known exploits by actors trying to deploy some ransomware, maybe crypto mining, trying to use your compute resources, business email compromise from people trying to defraud you, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're a larger enterprise, then you're probably a more interesting target for yet another kind of attacks, the ones that seek to exfiltrate your trade secrets. So industrial espionage is the key element here. In those cases, you're defending against very capable and well-funded groups who have a lot of time on their hands and are able to build custom tools and put together specific tactics to infiltrate your organization. So same goes for critical infrastructure or the energy vertical, where the goal could be destruction instead of just plain espionage, God forbid. So, and yet, when you look at all of these, there's always one point in common between these organizations of all sizes. They all suffer from a lack of resources to handle all the security events a typical day throws at them. So in my view, to directly answer your question of what low-hanging fruit gives you the most bang for the buck, I think the first thing you may start doing is ripping out noisy security products, because you want your team to focus on real threats. There's no point in paying for a product you do not pay attention to. And, believe me, based on conversation I had with a lot of people, your team's life will get a lot better as a consequence. Now, of course, I'm not saying just, rip out everything and create gaps in your security posture by doing so. No, you'd have to make sure you got some coverage. And, with the money saved, I think the next couple of things you want to make sure you have well in place is a vulnerability and patch management system, and maybe run some penetration tests for all internet-facing resources you might have.
We talk a lot about patch management. Yeah, it does. But you brought up patch management, and that's something that comes up in virtually every conversation that I have, as one of the most important things to do. And yet, it always seems to get pushed aside. One of the issues, of course, is always that before you can install a patch, you have to make sure it's not going to break anything else. And with patches coming from various vendors in abundance, we saw just within the past week or so, I think it was 3 or 4 new updates to Firefox alone. So if your company is standardized on that particular browser, how do you manage the mass of patches and the potential threat that the patch is going to cause when you have a company that's substantial size? You have to vet everything first. How do you find the time to do that and keep up with all of the other normal issues that you brought up here?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, patch management is a big issue, and honestly, some of the ones you brought up wouldn't be my top concern. A lot of the simple things like browser updates, for example, could go on automatically, but we have a lot of concerns around 2 major areas. One of them would be things like products which are under certification. Let's say the government mandates some certification for security products that are deployed in production environments, things like FIPS validation or protection profile certification. And those are a little bit harder to deal with because you're always worried about a patch installation that will not only fix the patch, but also bring along some additional features, change the version number, and next thing you know, you are out of compliance from a certification perspective. So these are really big issues. And the second one, which I wanted to mention, is there's a lot of embedded systems that are really hard to patch. And the first problem that a CISO would have to deal with is just inventory management of where are these things? How do they get updated? Do they even get patches released for them? So getting a handle over these 2 things is really critical for you to have a patch management system that's valuable to your enterprise posture, security posture. Now, there's a third thing that needs to come into play when it comes to implementing a policy for patch management, and that is making sure that within your SLAs, for example, you make sure that there's always the ability to patch very often and patch quickly. And for that, you may want to lean on a lot of the vendors that supply you with products to make sure that you have the ability to upgrade systems without downtime. So this is a critical element. You can do all the high availability you want, but at some point, load management, for example, becomes an issue, so you really do not want to lose certain critical services. So therefore, making sure that the products you put in place have the ability to do zero downtime upgrades is going to be really critical.
You know, the person in charge of security, whether it's a CISO, CIO, depending on the company, they always have so many things on their plate. They're always trying to balance, operations with making sure that they're all secure. And at the end of the day, there's usually something that is weighing heavily on their mind. So, tell me, what is it that when it comes to to threat management that and threat identification as well that keeps a CISO up at night? Is it defending against the corporate-wide crippling attack, such as the city of Baltimore is facing a continuing ransomware attack, for example, or is it death by 1,000 cuts, where there's all these little breaches, possibly just tons of malware coming in, phishing attacks, and you're just trying to keep up with the little stuff? Which is it that weighs most heavily on the corporate CISO?
Right, that's a very good question. Now, I'm not gonna claim that I have the answer to that for every CISO out there, but I've spoken to many of them over time, and honestly, they're generally not too concerned about the daily mundane type of attacks. It is true that none of them wants to see any of it happening, but the truth is, many small-scale intrusions happen, but they get caught, they get remediated very quickly, and most of the time, it's things like people clicking on the wrong link or download a piece of malware but end up not opening it, and end up causing no major harm. So sometimes it's a real intrusion, and potentially in some public cloud service. But again, the only goal may seem to be crypto mining. So in those cases where no intellectual property is stolen, no customer data is accessed, no corporate finance or legal files are accessed, the incident just get managed and closed. Some lessons are learned, maybe some tweaks to a security posture here and there are put in place. But all in all, kind of life moves on. But what really keeps them up at night is the kind of attack, whether it's sophisticated or not, by the way, it doesn't matter. It's the kind of attack that ends up exposing them to public shame and putting customer data in the hands of criminal actors. And that could potentially impact a vast number of victims. So really, nobody wants to be the next Equifax, which, if you guys remember, in 2017 exposed names, birth dates, social security numbers of somewhere along the lines of 143 million individuals, in addition to about, if I recall, about 200,000 credit card numbers. Or maybe this started with Marriott more recently, that was just last year, that exposed about 500 million records of hotel guests, including their names, birth dates, passport numbers, email addresses. So that's a lot to put out there. We've also, everybody has heard of the Facebook breach, not a breach, but the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, which exposed 87 million accounts to this company. And they just went ahead and harvested their profile information as well as their private messages and friends network. So now, many breaches are preventable, right? Because they are caused by unpatched systems for which a patch would already have existed. And even if not patched, at least some of the security devices that a CISO can put in place should have signatures for the relevant exploits, at least the known ones. So sometimes it's just exposed databases on the public clouds, right? But what's really worse is failing to act on a strong signal. So this not only keeps the CISO up at night, but it gives them nightmares when they're asleep. Take, for example, a breach that happened, I believe, last year. I'm not sure whether it was last year or the year before. The Panera breach. They were actually notified by a security researcher that their website was leaking customer data, and they did not take action for another 8 months. So this is the nightmare scenario in my view, and this is what CISOs are really worried about.
Yeah, there have also been cases where companies were notified, and instead of fixing the breach, they went after the researcher. Hard to imagine why that happens. So let's assume for a moment that a CISO feels pretty good about their environment. They've done recent audits, perhaps they've employed pen testers, they've done red team. They're pretty confident that they have a handle on their network. So good work, CISO. The big question is, what do you do next? You can't sit back and just, say, hey, I'm golden, my network is running perfectly. You know that there's always going to be a new zero day, there's always going to be a new attack. Assuming that you've done everything you're supposed to do now, how do you make sure that you're not going to get hit by something that's just going to blindside you?
Right. So there's actually a lot that can be done. Now, for that, I just want to go to a model that Gartner released maybe in 2014 or 2015, which in essence says, assume you have been breached. Right. So that's the starting point.
Always.
Assume you have been breached. Now go to work and find out where you have been breached, when have you been breached, how have you been breached, and execute a remediation plan. The reason is very simple. The CISO is here to enable the business, not to cripple it. So considerations like network performance and user experience play a really important role in what is on the table as tools to secure that network. So no environment, for example, is going to bring down bandwidth by 90% just because the traffic inspection or hey, we need to do SSL decryption. Sure, but that brings down the bandwidth by 90%. Nobody's going to allow that. And no environment is going to make a user wait several seconds, maybe even minutes, because the site they're browsing to or the file they're trying to download is being inspected in a sandbox. So, by its very nature, the prevention layer that most companies have needs to be fast to allow the business to continue humming. So that's why it relies mostly on signatures of previously seen attacks and malware that they can, and malware signatures that they can apply quickly. So, but unfortunately, between fast and secure, you have to choose one. So what's the solution? Well, leave the prevention layer the way it is, let it do its job, but also assume the breach and start hunting for the threat. This can be done in many different ways, and one of them is just the use of the most advanced threat detection technologies, which require some amount of time to assess the environment. So, for example, sandboxes, they can require several seconds for the fastest sandboxes out there, and some products, but they could take up to several minutes to render a verdict for something that's a file that's never been seen, for instance. Along the same lines, analytics products need to access vast amounts of data, maybe even third-party logs, actually most of the time, third-party logs, to look for anomalies into the network and what's happening. And this can take hours, and in some cases, days to play out, just because, the speed at which you collect logs, the rate at which some events are arriving to a centralized, maybe SIM, just takes time, right? And then you put the analysis on top of that. But guess what? I think that minutes and hours to detect an intrusion are much better than finding out months later you have been breached, which seems to be the case for 68% in one study of all the breaches in 2018. That's, by the way, the study that was published by Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. So, finally, what else can you do? Maybe you can even afford to have a threat hunting team to go after the use cases you haven't already covered. So, for example, privilege misuse is considered a form of breach and was a source of 12% of breaches in 2018, according to the same report. And that class of incidents is unfortunately difficult to cover with just automated tools.
We spend a lot of time talking about technology, but one of the big issues that our industry faces, one that doesn't nearly get as much attention as it deserves, is that the average CISO spends maybe 2 to 4 years in any given job. There are some projects that will take many more years than that to complete. If you need to rip out a SIM, for example, there's planning, there's analysis, there's the speccing out the SIM, the installation, all that takes time. You don't start that on day one when you walk into a job. So one of the things that we're seeing is that there are some CISOs that are putting off big projects if they think they're going to leave. They need to do things that'll show results now as opposed to down the road when they're gone. If a company CISO is not willing to undertake these large multi-year projects, perhaps they see themselves as lame ducks. What should the CEO, what should the board be doing to ensure that these long-term security projects, essential for the company, actually stay on track, regardless of whether the CISO is still there or not? Do you entice a CISO by saying, look, even if you're gone when we finish this project, you'll still get some kind of bonus, if you spend the time doing it now? What kind of carrot or stick do you need to make sure that the long-term projects actually get the attention they need? Another big one, of course, would be data classification. That could be a huge multi-year project in a big corporation. But somebody's got to start it, somebody's got to watch it, somebody's got to finish it. How do you balance that with, job hoppers?
Yeah, that's right. I'm not going to address the compensation aspect of it because so many variables there. But first of all, I just want to say that all the CISOs I know are in this role because they believe in the mission. Everyone comes to a CISO role with some sort of a life story, but each one of these stories is rooted in a deep desire to make the internet a safer place and to protect the people from bad actors. So, given that perspective, none of them, I believe, would just forego starting a big project just because they think they might leave soon. Most of them come into the job with a desire to make a difference by building a strong team around them to begin with and tackling some serious challenge and make a serious dent into it. So, in my view, a CEO or even the board ought to look at the reasons why CISOs leave in the first place. And I can articulate a few of them here. And I sincerely hope I'm making justice. I'm making justice to this topic. So the first one is burnout. That's really the big one in my opinion. Whether it's in the digital space or even in the physical world, those who are entrusted with securing us and our environments are under a constant, relentless, heavy pressure to perform. They must get it right every single time, whereas the adversary, as you know, only needs to be successful once. So some of the pressure comes from the fact that attacks can happen day or night, and based on my experience, they seem to prefer weekends and holidays. So in addition to just attacks,
indeed,
CSOs are also constantly required to oversee new business initiatives like, oh, we're doing this cloud migration, we're integrating with this legacy application, we're connecting disparate technologies, and that adds to the pressure that they live in. So it's a very tough job. So the second reason I want to mention here for unhappiness as a job is just lack of budgets. I think I have only met one CISO ever that told me they have all the budget they ask for. And I'm sure everyone here wants to know, what's the trick? Tell us the trick. How does he do it? I'm sorry. I forgot what it was. No, just kidding. It's compliance, actually. He was always able to dig up some regulation that the organization has to comply with, and this seems to open up the purse. But again, he's kind of a special case. He's in a highly regulated industry dealing with highly sensitive military equipment manufacturing, so that may not be the rule for everybody else. Actually, to the contrary, everyone else says their budgets are too low, and that forces CISOs to choose between things like headcount and security services. So I have met so many CISOs that tell me they'd love to get a particular product, but they don't have the manpower to run it, to manage it, and use it day to day. So, and you would think in those cases that automation can help to solve this problem. Well, 28% of organizations today report that absolutely zero budget for automation. So that's a problem by itself. And 34% believe that automation requires too much staff to implement and maintain. So some of it is based on real life experience, but some of it is just perception and expectation. So the third reason I want to cite here for the CISOs leaving companies is just very natural. It's the company's health. And this is not unique to CISO's role, right? But a company that is having to weather market difficulties does not usually create the best atmosphere for people to thrive. So employee turnover is usually fairly high, and to add insult to injury, it seems like 57% of organizations are unable to hire skilled security staff today. And this leads to a big shortage of expertise. And according to a Ponemon Institute study, 62% of organizations believe that lack of shortage of skilled people, staff, directly diminishes their organization's security posture. So no matter what kind of tools you put out there, not having enough skilled people will diminish your organization's security posture. And finally, I just want to mention this in passing, but I really believe that this is somewhat of a past issue. It's the alignment with the rest of the C-suite and the board of directors. I think it used to be a major concern to get board-level attention on cybersecurity issues, and this can lead CISOs to leave. But things seem to be getting a lot better lately. I've looked at a study, for example, that shows that only 11% of organizations cite the lack of executive alignment in prioritizing SOC automation, for example, as being a big issue in their organization. So hopefully that rounds it up.
Well, recent statistics from various sources have told us that traditional virus attacks, basic malware, even the ubiquitous Nigerian prince attacks, those are going down. What's going up are spear phishing attacks, fileless phishing attacks. From the perspective of the CISO looking to stop that next generation attack, we're talking about tomorrow's attacks today. What should they be focusing on now to head off the next attack that's coming?
So I just want to start by kind of setting the record straight on one thing. The fileless attack that people talk about. Every time I read a blog about a fileless attack, it always starts with a file being sent over email. So it always makes me laugh when I see these kind of things. But it is true that when you do forensics, for example, you may not be able to find any file on an endpoint, but it has always started somehow, most of the time at least. It would start with a Word document that has some kind of a Visual Basic script or maybe trigger a PowerShell script, and the next thing you know is something gets downloaded, put into the registry and for persistence, and you start processes without really needing to write a file, but there's always a file somewhere. So, but one thing is clear. We live in a highly adaptive world, for sure. Innovation comes at a breakneck speed, both from the threat actors and security experts. So nowadays, it takes less than 48 hours for some threat groups to incorporate newly identified vulnerabilities into their attack campaigns. So it does not make it any easier that there's no global security threat exchange forum where security products can take a head start on the defensive side before vulnerabilities and maybe sometimes even proofs of concept are published. That's a big issue. So there are a few initiatives here and there, like, for example, the Microsoft MAP program. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that for vulnerability sharing. You have the Cyber Threat Alliance for threat intelligence sharing among some of the member companies, which is growing in size, which is a very good thing. But there is nothing that is global. So, for example, how would a security vendor know about the next Drupal, Apache, or WebLogic vulnerability? How would researchers safely disclose a proof of concept exploit to the security vendors? We just don't have such a mechanism today. So that creates a situation where protections are deployed in a very short time window, but deploying them poses a serious problem. We just talked about it when we started the webcast. And the most exploited vulnerability that we see today is pretty much 2 years old. And that's because threat actors are still finding unpatched systems to infiltrate. So, going back to a CISO's perspective, I think we need to go back to basics of cybersecurity hygiene. Patch often, patch quickly. So the IT infrastructure needs to be built to sustain frequent maintenance window, and I already mentioned that, without really incurring service downtime. Secondly, I would argue that a CISO needs to look for solutions that reduce workload on their SOC team and improve the effectiveness of level 1 SOC analysts. So imagine, for example, you can put in the hands of just the first level SOC analyst enough intelligence and automation to correlate what looks at multiple security solutions and puts together a global picture of an incident, including historical view, right? If you're dealing with a host, for example, where you think it's been infected, you can get a historical view of what happened on that host, given the right identity management in place. And you can see all the third-party threat intel that either validate or invalidate what you're looking at in those findings. So that would tremendously cut down on the time and the skill level needed to escalate true incidents to threat response team. So what that does is it frees up your next level SOC analyst to research the more advanced threats that you're facing.
Well, there's so much more that we could be saying on this, and I'm thoroughly enjoying our discussion, but we actually have run long, and I'm sorry we have not been able to get to any of the attendee questions. All of your questions will be turned over to Mounir and his team. They will be able to get back to you after the event with answers, but this does draw a close to today's webcast. So I thank everyone for joining us for tomorrow's Attacks Today. We hope to continue this discussion soon. So good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you may be. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back again to talk to you shortly. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen. It was a pleasure.